Ronald Reagan reached for the door handle, ready to walk out, and then he stopped. For 2 days in October 1986, inside a small white house on the windswept coast of Reykjavik, the leaders of the two superpowers had circled the most radical idea of the nuclear age, the total elimination of the weapons that could end the world. They came astonishingly close. In the real history, it all collapsed in the final hour over the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's cherished missile defense program, when Gorbachev demanded it be confined to the laboratory and Reagan refused. The two men parted grim and empty-handed. But in this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Imagine that, in that 11th hour, exhaustion and ambition tipped the other way. Reagan accepts a compromise. Research on SDI continues, but deployment is deferred for 10 years. Gorbachev accepts that the dream of defense need not die for the dream of disarmament to live. And on October 12, 1986, the two of them sign a framework committing both nations to eliminate all ballistic nuclear weapons within a decade. What no one in that room could have known was how much harder the signing would prove than the negotiating. The handshake was the easy part. Both men flew home to capitals that regarded the Hofthi framework not as triumph, but as recklessness. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the defense hawks who surrounded Reagan warned that abolition stripped the United States of the very advantages decades of investment had bought. The American deterrent, they argued, rested on survivable missiles. Trade them away and you traded away the peace they purchased. George Shultz, the Secretary of State, spent the winter of 1986 and into 1987 translating a leader's vision into language the Senate might one day ratify. In Moscow, Gorbachev faced his own uneasy generals. The Soviet General Staff had built its prestige and its budget around the strategic rocket forces, and they did not surrender that primacy gladly. Eduard Shevardnadze, his foreign minister and closest diplomatic partner, worked the same problem from the other side. Both leaders had staked their authority on a promise the institutions beneath them distrusted. The framework could still have died there, strangled by the bureaucracies it threatened. That it did not was a measure of how badly both men needed it to live. Trust was never the currency of the Cold War. Verification was. Every previous arms agreement had founded or been diluted on the same rock. How does one superpower know the other is truly destroying what it claims to destroy? Abolition raised the stakes beyond anything the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty or the wary tallies of earlier accords had contemplated. A staged elimination treaty took shape over the following 2 years, and at its heart lay an inspection regime more intrusive than either side had ever accepted. Soviet monitors stood inside American missile plants. American monitors watched Soviet silos filled with concrete and rocket bodies cut apart under cameras. On-site inspection, the historically hardest sticking point, became the price of the whole enterprise. Each warhead retired was a warhead another nation's officials had to witness. The reductions were deliberate and staged, year by year, so that neither side ever felt the floor drop out from beneath its security at once. It was slow, suspicious, intrusive work, and it was working. For Gorbachev, the treaty was never only about peace. It was about money. The Soviet economy in 1986 was a structure straining under its own weight, military spending that devoured the budget, falling oil prices that gutted hard currency earnings, and the bleeding war in Afghanistan that had dragged on since 1979. Only months before Reykjavik, the Chernobyl disaster of April 1986 had laid bare the brittleness of Soviet institutions and sharpened Gorbachev's reformist urgency. Every missile not built, every rocket regiment stood down, was capital that perestroika desperately needed. He redirected the savings toward a civilian economy that had starved for decades. But disarmament could not repeal the contradictions of central planning. The savings were real. The system that received them was not ready to use them well. Reform demanded openness. Glasnost invited criticism, and criticism corroded the authority that reform required. Gorbachev had bet that disarmament would buy him time. The question was whether the economy would reform faster than it unraveled. The continent that had lived longest under the nuclear shadow felt the change first. For 40 years, the security of Western Europe had rested on an American promise that the United States would answer a Soviet attack with nuclear retaliation. The intermediate-range missiles that bristled across the continent, the American Pershing IAs, the Soviet SS-20s, had been the flashpoint of the early 1980s. Now, as ballistic arsenals shrank year by year, NATO and the Warsaw Pact were forced to confront a question they had long deferred. What did security mean without the nuclear umbrella? The Allied governments of Western Europe, partners who had sheltered under American protection, now weighed a future where that shelter was deliberately dismantled. Attention swung back to conventional forces, to tanks, troops, and the long front line across Germany, where the Soviet Union held real numerical advantages. Some in NATO feared abolition handed Moscow the conventional war it could never have won under the nuclear threat. And then came a complication neither superpower had fully reckoned with. The two giants were not the only ones holding weapons. As Washington and Moscow disarmed, the smaller nuclear powers and the threshold states, the nations standing at the edge of building a bomb, began recalculating their own positions. For some, superpower restraint was an opportunity. If the giants were shrinking their arsenals, a modest force suddenly counted for more in relative terms. For others, the new order looked like a club they were being asked to join without a vote, and they demanded inclusion in the arrangements being written over their heads. The logic that had governed the Cold War, in which two overwhelming arsenals dwarfed all others, was loosening. A world of two nuclear superpowers had been frightening but legible. A world of many smaller players, each watching the others, was something else. Abolition at the top did not automatically mean abolition everywhere. It meant the arithmetic of fear was being redistributed. For 4 decades, peace had rested on a paradox: mutual assured destruction. The certainty that any attack would bring annihilation in return had made the unthinkable also the unusable. Now, as ballistic arsenals were dismantled stage by stage, strategists confronted a world where that grim stabilizer no longer governed how leaders behaved in a crisis. This was the deepest uncertainty of all. Deterrence had been ugly, but it had been predictable. Remove it, and what restrained a nervous government in the hours when a confrontation spiraled? Some argued that without the doomsday machine, conventional crises could escalate more freely since the ultimate break was gone. Others insisted that a world with fewer warheads was simply a world with less to fear, that the absence of the trigger made the gun harmless. No one truly knew because the experiment had never been run. The old logic was dissolving faster than any new logic could replace it. Humanity was walking off a map it had drawn in 1945, and the territory beyond the edge was unmarked. So was it worth it? Set the gains and the dangers side by side, and the ledger refuses to balance cleanly. On one side, tens of thousands of warheads gone, an economy granted breathing room, a verification regime that forced two enemies to look directly into each other's arsenals. On the other, a Europe nervous about conventional war, a scattering of lesser powers recalculating their ambitions, and the unsettling silence where the certainty of deterrence used to be. The Hofthi framework did not deliver a utopia, and it did not summon the apocalypse its critics feared. It traded a known set of dangers for an unknown one. Perhaps that is the honest verdict on every act of disarmament, that safety is never abolished, only relocated. The real Reykjavik ended in failure, and the world kept its weapons and its terrible, stabilizing fear. This imagined one ended in a signature and inherited a different uncertainty. Which timeline was safer, we cannot finally say. We can only say that on October 12, 1986, in a small White House by a cold sea, two men held the future in their hands, and that the choice they made, in either world, was never as simple as peace.